All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this professional development webinar. We're really excited. We have Tim Martin here, which you can kind of see based on his slides, who works for the Indiana Department of Education. And he is the assessment content specialist for both science and social studies. And I'm sure he can give you a little bit more background on that. So I'm just going to go ahead and give it over to Tim, and then once he's done presenting, it is open for questions. So if throughout you guys have any questions, just jot them down and you can ask them at the end. All right, Tim, it's your time.
From inclusion to high ability. In my last 2 years at middle school, I developed and taught a STEM curriculum, STEM course. I was in the classroom when the science standards came out. So part of my presentation today will be kind of what my department did to try and start implementing these standards back in 2016 when they were first introduced. We're going to talk today a little about, and some of you may have heard or seen presentations before with blueprints and specifications, some of you may not, but I wanted to kind of go over what these resources are, where you can find them, and how you can use them to better inform classroom curriculum, how you teach the standards, and what you can kind of expect with items on the iLearn with science and computer science and really any of the contents. Then I'll kind of go into the computer science standards with how they're set up, and then talk about some instructional strategies, some of the things that I did in the classroom and my department did as well. So when we create an assessment, and iLearn I got on board just as it was starting to be created, so I was kind of here on the ground floor. We don't just go in and sit down and write items. We actually kind of plan it all out before an item is even conceived. And we call these blueprints. It's just like going in and building a house. We don't just throw together some pieces of wood and hope the house stands. We actually sit down with professionals and we figure out where we want to go, where we are, how we're going to get there. We did this with educators in January and February of last year, and they got together in content areas and grade bands and decided which of the standards were of higher priority than others. We have to assess all of them, but some are more important. And we also kind of which, in the whole scheme of things, and not just in the reporting category, but in the assessment as a whole, kind of I guess again, the priority. We rated them 1, 2, and 3. You'll see that in a second. The URL on this slide is where you can find those and all the iLearn resources, specifications, blueprints. You can find release items repository and other things I'll go over. And let's go, there we are. The iLearn Science Grade 4 blueprint I've just thrown up. You can find blueprints for all content areas, all grades, and they all have this format. They tell what the reporting category is, and this is the group of standards that the educators felt fit together. For science, the educators decided to go a little different route than we have in the past. In the past, we did reporting categories by content area, with life sciences, physical sciences, earth sciences. The teachers felt that really wasn't how science is being taught or assessed in the classroom anymore, but we really are focusing on processes. Whereas it's nice if the students remember how to identify rocks next year, but it's more important if they know how to ask a question and figure out how to find the answers to that question using data. So they rearranged the standards into categories, process categories that they felt fit. So you will see all the standards kind of jumbled together, so we don't have necessarily all standards in one content area in one reporting category. We include the standard code We did not include the full language of the standard on these blueprints because we wanted to keep them a little cleaner, but when we get to item specifications, you'll see that the full language of the standard is on those. The standard item range is where you start kind of seeing where the teachers set those priorities. The minimum column is how many items as a minimum could be on the iLearn in a given year. So if a standard, for example, 3.5E1 highlighted there, has a minimum of 1, you know that every single year an item written to that standard will be present. And it could be a maximum of 3 for that standard. If we go one above it, 3.5DI2, you see the minimum is a 0. So there's a potential that in a given year that item may not appear, but it does have a max of 1, so it could. On the far right, we give the range for that reporting category of how many items could be on the iLearn, and the range is 12 to 14 for the questioning and modeling category in grade 4. We also give the percentage on the full assessment that that item may appear. So again, our 3.5E1 item is between 2 and 7% of the assessment as a whole. That 3.5DI2 would be 0 to 2% of the assessment as a whole. We also give the weight that the educators gave to that reporting category. So questioning and modeling in grade 4 could be between 25 and 29% of the assessment as a whole. If you want a little more detailed look at item blueprints, excuse me, if you go to that website, that URL, at the bottom, last year we did several webinars for each content area where we discussed those blueprints in more detail and more content specific. You're welcome to pull those down and view those. So once we have blueprints, we're still not quite ready to write items. We then go to a step where we write item specifications. And item specifications really formalize how that standard will be presented to students on the assessment. And this is not how it should be taught. This is not for any really instructional purposes per se. This is for the iLearn assessment. How would that standard be written, or how would that item be written to that standard? And again, we created educator committees last year. They spent 3 days writing these, and they did one for each standard in each content area in each grade. And so these provide vocabulary, not exhaustive, but a vocabulary list. They provide content limits, so what should we not assess relevant to that standard. Evidence statements, kind of the student will be able to do this to prove proficiency for that standard. We give a list of potential item types. And we also provide a sample item. So these specifications are used by item writers and by the department to check and make sure that the items do present how the educators want them to, and that they do assess the standard how educators in Indiana felt they should. So here's an example of an item specification. I used a grade 6 standard, 6PS3. So at the top there, you see we have the code again, so you can refer back to the blueprint. And we have the full standard language so that you can see what that is. Content limits, as I mentioned, so teachers have indicated that for the assessment that we shouldn't do certain things. So for this standard, they don't want us assessing light or sound energy to talk about the potential and kinetic energy. They felt that was an important content limit to put on. You can't see by the arrow, they also didn't want us to look at mechanical engine energy either. The construct relevant vocabulary is some vocabulary that the teachers, again, this is a teacher-produced list, not exhaustive, but words that they felt that students should be able to interact with without additional supports. So these words may appear in items without an additional glossary or footnote to explain what they are. So any words that are in the standard or in this construct relevant vocabulary are fair game. teachers also looked at all the different types of items that we could put on iLearn. So multiple choice, drag and drop, fill in the blank, grids, graphs, things like that. And they came up with a list of suggestions that we could use to assess this standard. So for this standard, multiple choice, technology enhanced, extended response, constructed response, or a simulation where the students would run through like a mini lab are all fair game as items to use for this standard. Depth of knowledge. We all know that depth of knowledge for a standard is really over a range, and as you should be teaching that as a range in the classroom. But for the assessment, we asked educators to give us a target depth of knowledge for that standard. And so that is indicated on the specification. And an item is written to that target DOK. We also have a context box. What this means is instead of asking just the question right out, like in math, we might ask 5 plus 3 equals. So that's no context. We don't need to go into a whole long involved story about someone going to the store and getting 5 things in their basket and then putting 2 more things and how many things do they have. So the teachers looked at the standard and decided for this standard, for items written to the standard, should we write that background story even if it's a simple sentence in order for students to be oriented enough to answer that. For this standard, they said that that would be required. We also asked them about allowable stimulus material. These are things that introduce or present data to the students that help them with the interaction that we're asking them to do. Each specification has 1 or more evidence statements. Again, this is from educators saying what the students should be able to do to show proficiency in the standard. Then we had educators write a sample item to the standard with the specification format, the constraints in mind. These are not secure. You are free to use these sample items, take them directly for your own assessments or board work or whatever else you want to do in the classroom. You're also free to take them and change them or manipulate them in any way you wish. So they are there for you to use. One of the things that we were very thoughtful of as we started with iLearn is the accessibility of the assessment. So in the past, with assessments, what we've basically done is we've written the items, we presented them to educators, educators approved them, then we decided what needed to happen to make those accessible. We wanted to kind of turn that around, excuse me, for this assessment and think about accessibility from the very beginning. So starting with those blueprint committees and into the specification committees and so on, we were looking at accessibility, not just for special populations, but for all students. How can we make these items in this assessment the most accessible, the least complex language, that they can really show what they know and not be tripped up because of that interaction. So we have a section on each specification that talks about various accessibility considerations, and these may also be useful for your classroom as you're writing assessments to kind of look and see how you can make those assessments a little more accessible to your populations. All right, so I wanted to go again over just the standards real quick and talk about them and kind of how we started viewing them in my department in middle school. When we first got the 2016 science standards, we were pretty excited. We started looking at them, kind of seeing what was new, what was the same, what changed. And then we noticed off to the side this category that was brand new in 2016 called computer science standards. And we all looked at each other, and we were in a district meeting with the science teachers, and we all looked at each other and said, yeah, I guess who's going to get to teach those? And sure enough, about a month later, it came out that this had to be assessed through the science assessment. And this is a federal requirement. I discovered that when I came to the department. The feds for federal accountability are requiring the computer science standards be assessed through the science assessment. So it is not a state mandate but it is a federal mandate. So computer science standards were written very thoughtfully, knowing that in a few years, if they were too technical, that the standards could be out of date. The technology is changing so quickly that they had to be broad enough to last the years until the next review, but also specific enough to give students kind of that hands-on, heads-up, moving forward into that digital economy that they're headed to. So they were written to be inquiry-based. So rather than kind of dictate knowledge specifically, they were a little more open-ended, and they were really intended to have hands-on experience. The students should get in there, kind of like with the science standards, get their hands dirty and do something. The other thing is, even though the feds mandated that it's done through science, they were not written to be taught in a single subject area. They really were written with the eye that the entire faculty, the entire school community even, be helping these students learn and become proficient in the science standards. And I'll talk about that in a few slides. And then if you're looking at the standards over the grade bands as it goes from K to 8, you'll see that they really do scaffold and build on each other. That as the students require knowledge and abilities, as they acquire experience, they're being asked to do a little more and dig a little deeper into the different standards and into the different areas. So the computer science standards were written with 5 core concepts in mind. We have data and information, computing devices and systems, programs and algorithms, networking and communication, impact and culture. And as I mentioned, they are grouped into 3 grade bands, K through 2, 3 through 5, and 6 through 8. Because iLearn is not given under grade 3, at least until the legislature decides otherwise, we're only testing grade 4 and grade 6 for the computer science standards. And I know there are questions about those, and I'll get to that in just a minute about what that means for those grades. So as we were looking at these standards, and I just kind of alternated 3, 5, 6, 8 on here, we were looking at kind of these core concepts and really what they were. And I think one thing that a lot of people, a lot of educators are worried about is when they think computer science, they're thinking coding, they're thinking binary language, they're thinking, having the students sit down and create these elaborate programs or video games or whatever else it might be. And that really isn't the case. As you dig down into the computer science standards, you'll see that there's one that kind of has more to do with that coding and representation of data, and that's this category, data and information. So algorithms, coding, and how data is represented is in this category, but the other categories are actually probably things that you're already doing with students, especially if you have a one-on-one device. So computing devices and systems is really a lot about troubleshooting. What do I do if my screen doesn't turn on? What do I do if I can't connect to the internet? So again, things that the students are probably already doing in your classroom that you just kind of need to give them a little structure and help on. There are standards about distinguishing between hardware versus software. What exactly is hardware? What does it do? What is software? What does it do? How do they interact? And then there's generally a standard thrown in about machine intelligence, how machines think, how humans think, how they affect each other. Programs and algorithms, this seems like the scary category, but it really isn't. Again, it's that data category. Programs and algorithms is a lot about choosing and using digital tools appropriately. So given this task, what tool should I use or how should I use it? How do I best present my data? How can I best give this class presentation? There's some basic programming. You can see here in the 3 to 5 category, they're using block-based visual programming. If you don't know what that is, that's basically similar to what they do with Lego Mindstorms or some of the other robotic programs where they have blocks of code like move forward 2 steps or turn right or pause 3 seconds, and they're already in blocks, and the kids take that and drag it over, and they can order them however they want, and then they run the program. So they're really not sitting down and doing actual code in this grade band. Networking and communication is all about how do I collaborate online? How do I do a group project in Google Docs? How do I send appropriate emails to group members or my teacher? And then we have impact and culture. And this is where we get into the digital citizenship, the ethical behaviors and issues that students will need to start grappling with, impacts of technology on individuals and society, and things in this, especially at the elementary level, would be simple things like, when should I text on the phone? Should I text on the phone when I'm riding my bike? Should I, tease people online? Just simple things that they need to start really integrating as they grow to become digital citizens. So one of the questions that we've been asked a lot is, well, the students have never had these standards, so how are they going to do? How do we know that basically they won't fail these standards and bomb iLearn? We started field testing computer science items last year on our last administration of iStep Plus. And the word did not get out as well as it could have that we were doing that. And so I don't think a lot of teachers were really focused yet on the computer science standards. This year was kind of the first year that they were supposed to be taught. So we were very nervous about field testing these. Now, a field test item means that the student does not, their score is not affected, that they interact with that item, they don't know that it's a field test item. We get data back and see how the students did, how the item did in the field. So items are approved by educator committees, they're put on the test as field test items, and then we get and look at the data, and based on certain statistical flags, we either reject that item or we accept it into the pool. So is it too easy? Is it too hard? Do students who did well on the test overall bomb this specific item? Because that could be a flag. Does it favor one group, generally a minority group, over another group? So we look at all those statistics, and our results were very pleasing. In grade 4, we field tested 12 items, and all 12 were accepted, meaning the students did well on those. And then grade 6, we only lost 1 of 14. So the students, I think, are doing well. They can do these items, they can meet these standards, and I think especially after this year and going forward, as the standards are being taught more and more in the classroom, they'll do even better. All right, so here is kind of where I start going into kind of what I did as a teacher, giving hopefully you some ideas, some strategies that you can use, because I know it becomes overwhelming, especially as an elementary teacher. You have so much on your plate, and it's just one more thing that you have to fit in. And how can you do that? How can you kind of take this burden on? One of the things that we did and we looked at was that even though these standards are kind of grouped into these core concepts, we noticed that they might overlap or fit well together across those concept boundaries. So we might be able to teach 3, 4, 5 standards within one unit or one lesson without really having to write something new altogether or having to write a different lesson for each one. The next slide, I'm going to show you what my department did for grades 6 to 8 standards. Again, this is how we sat down, we talked about it, we came up with these groupings. I did not teach under grade 6 in my classroom experience, but I sat down with the grade 3 to 5 standards, and using some of the same criteria, I put together a 3 to 5 list for those of you in that grade band. And again, these are just what we did. You may find it completely different. You may find that it doesn't work for you, but this is what worked for the unit and curriculum plans that we had. So we regrouped and kind of did 4 groupings: hardware and troubleshooting, choosing and using tech tools, logic and programming, and then digital citizenship. So you can see that, yes, I mean, the standards are grouped into core concepts for a reason. You can see a little bit of overlap, especially kind of in that choosing and using tech tools. There's a lot of standards that talk about how do I present data, how do I use data, what's a good way to use specific tools. And again, the 3 to 5 band, I just sat down and grouped them into those same groupings using the kind of the same criteria that my science department did in middle school. These slides will be available to you, and my email is also at the end. If you want a copy of these slides, I'd be happy to send it out. Again, nothing is secure, and it's all fair game for you to pick apart and use as you wish. The other thing that we looked at as a department is how can we basically get the building in on helping us with these. As a science department, we piloted one-to-one devices. I piloted and created a paperless classroom, which my department ended up using. And so we really were the spearhead, especially the 7th graders coming in to our school, with creating these kind of digital expectations and how do you treat the hardware and what do you need to do in certain cases? How do you do the apps and the software to make you successful in school? But we really wanted, and we kind of really kept talking to the faculty and finally got them on board with kind of what their part of it and what they needed to do. So we came up with kind of 3 basic things. One was to scaffold early training and build those expectations. So at the beginning of every year, our principal called together the 7th graders, then a separate convo called together the 8th graders, and just talked about digital citizenship, about one-to-one devices, and kind of set the tone of the year for that. And we also had our counselors would do once or twice a year digital citizenship lessons, where they would come around to the classrooms and just talk generally about privacy and security and safety online. And so we kind of were able to use those as springboards into the rest of the year. We could always point back and say, well, remember in the convo you did this, or remember for digital citizenship you need to do that. The other thing that we felt very strongly with is using device contracts, and this is for students and parents to let them know what expectations and consequences are. A lot of things, especially, it's first period and I only have 3% on my iPad. Or, well, my iPad is at mom's house, but I was at dad's house last night, so I don't have it today. So setting up front and being very clear about what those expectations and consequences will be, especially if you're starting to rely more and more on those devices, and teaching them what that digital citizenship aspect is. And then finally, we really emphasized, and we were starting to get buy-in by the time I left, with how all adults in the building should reinforce expectations. Not sharing passwords. If somebody overheard, even if it was the custodian, overheard 2 kids saying, oh, here's my password, so you can get in and get that. Or, throwing their backpack with their iPad in across the floor, and things like that, having all adults kind of remind them what those expectations would be. And that really helps kind of reinforce the standards that we were trying to teach. Kind of the third main area was we looked at resources that we could give to our students during times when they might have finished a test early or a lab early and have some free time or downtime, or when we needed to work with a small group and the class at large, instead of giving them a worksheet with a crossword on it, we might give them one of these resources. This would go more toward that programming, coding, using logic. These types of things would feed into that and those standards. You may still need to do some direct instruction and some structured activities for that. But really, we found if you give kids some of the kind of go do this instead of playing math games, I want you to go on Khan Academy and do a lesson. or go to code.org and see if you can do one of those activities. That they really enjoyed it and they got it. I think one of the scariest things is kind of letting them go and realizing that they've probably had a device in their hands since they were less than a year old, that they do understand devices, they know how to interact with online environments. And if we give them that push and a little bit of structure, that they really will get it and they really will be able to understand and perform well. A few resources that we have from the department for the test in general. If you have not yet gone to the iLearn page on our website, I encourage you to do so. There is an overwhelming number of resources there that can help you with various ways on how the test is developed, on what's expected on the test, guidance, like what the calculator guidance and policy is, the accessibility and accommodations. We also have a lot of assessment literacy pieces, especially written in family-friendly and parent-friendly language. So if you have parents asking you about iLearn, you can download some brochures and things there. Further, our vendor, American Institutes for Research, or AIR, has a portal which you can also access through the DOE website, and has a lot more resources, including the test administrator manuals for iLearn that you can download and look through. They are not secure. Some technology resources, the secure browser, and some other things, again, more assessment literacy resources that you are free to access and download. All right, I realized I thought it was in my script and it wasn't, but I do remember I wanted to talk quick about grade bands, and there's a concern about if a grade 4 student has a grade 4 to 6 standard, how is that presented? Because it, sorry, 3 to 5 standard, and it's a grade 4 student, how do they interact with that? All of our items are written to the grade level. So in the 3 to 5 grade band, we assume that a grade 4 student has not yet mastered that standard, that they are kind of in the middle of their experience and knowledge for that standard, and so items are written to that. For a grade 6 student in the 6 to 8 band, they have just been introduced to that standard for that year. And so we do not expect proficiency or mastery of those standards, but we do expect that they have an introductory knowledge and skill ability for those standards. So again, all items are looked at by educators, and they have all been approved by educators, and they've all gone through that field test and data review so before they become operational items. So that is my presentation and my slides, so we'll open it to any questions that you may have.
If you all do have any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
All right, so my question would be, there used to be, for the old iStep, there was a chart that had pluses, checks, and minuses to show that importance of levels of the standards. I haven't been able to find that for any subjects. Is that available for this, for the computer science and or other subjects as well?
Excellent question. We have been getting a lot of that. That has been replaced by the blueprint. So let me go back real quick. So those min-max columns have kind of replaced that checklist. So if you look and you can kind of see if it has a minimum of 0, it may or may not appear on the test. That would be like the check minus. I think on this one, so 0 to 1, 0 to 2, it might have none, but it might go up to 2. That might be like the check. and then the minimum of 1 would be the check plus. So instead of kind of that document, we've baked it into our blueprint and did educator priorities. Does that answer the question?
Yes, and thank you. I just had you muted again so I could write that down.
Okay.
Could you repeat one more time how I know the difference between a check, a minus, and a check plus, or what they were?
It's going to be different for each content area in each grade, but there's usually 3 different ranges on that min-max column. But usually if it has a minimum of 1, that was going to be the check plus. Those are the standards teachers thought were the highest priorities. And then with the range of 0, like on this one, 0 to 1 would be the check minus, and 0 to 2 would be the check. But for each grade and content area, you're going to have to look at it and see what those ranges are.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, we have a question in the chat. Can you see it, or do you want me to read it out loud?
I'm not sure how to get to the chat.
Okay, I'll just read it. So this person said, I noticed that teachers did not want students tested over sound energy, yet the term sound energy was included in the vocabulary. This was on the first slides. Am I understanding this correctly?
So I think there's another standard that talks about sound energy, if I'm remembering correctly. So they may have just taken and copy-pasted vocabulary over into the spec, but the content limits trump the vocabulary. So if the content limit says no sound energy for that standard, there will be nothing about sound energy for that standard, but there may be for another one.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay.
Please don't feel afraid to talk, and if you don't want to talk and just want to put your question in the chat, that's totally fine as well. Kim was asking if the slides will be available. Tim, will you email these slides to me once we're finished, and then I can send them out to our group?
Yeah, absolutely, I can do that.
Perfect. Another question was, were the CSTA standards referenced in the creation of these Indiana CS standards?
I'm not sure what CSTA is, or at least I don't want to say something if I'm not sure.
Okay. CSTA is just the Computer Science Teachers Association.
Oh, okay, so like more of a national standard. I was not present for the creation of the computer science standards, so I can't speak to that directly. I'm not sure what resources they used.
Devin was saying that there is a pretty good one-to-one relationship between the CSTA and Indiana CS standards. So maybe. All right, does anyone else have any questions, or we can end a little bit early? Another question, Tim, was, do you have a feel for how many schools are having technology classes, in particular teach these standards versus integrating them into the science curriculum?
I have not heard recent, and Jake Caressel may be more on top of this than I am, but the last number I heard a little while ago is about 15 to 20% had a dedicated technology class. again, he may have a better number on that than I do.
Devin, his name is Jake Caressel. He's the computer science specialist with the Indiana Department of Education. He's part of the CS for Indiana leadership team. So if you want his contact, just send me an email after this and I can send you his email. Also, if you don't have a question at this very moment, Tim has been so kind to provide us with his email and contact. So if something comes up like this evening, later this week, that you heard something and have a question about, would it be okay if they just sent you a quick email, Tim?
Absolutely, that's what we're here for.
Perfect. So yeah, if you can't think of something now or you're reviewing the slides or the presentation later, you have his contact, so feel free to reach out. If that is all the questions, then we can go ahead and wrap this up a little early. Tim, thank you so much for providing us with this information. I know that iLearn can be super stressful, not only on the students, but also on the teachers. So I think this was really great and a great resource for the CS for Indiana community and just Indiana CS educators in general. So we really appreciate you doing this for us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, we will end a little early. Everyone enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.